دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV networks today. Again with a very special individual, Professor Henning Melber. We've had him on before. We spoke about the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and Henning of course brought to light very many things that are pertinent to our current context, most specifically the discussion on ethics. But today I want to take Henning a little further and bring him also back home again when we talk about the black middle classes. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Henning, for making this time in your short schedule.
Thank you very much. I feel privileged, if not honored, to be on your show again.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Henning. So the last time we spoke a lot about your work in the foundation and of course the thoughts and ideas of the pioneer of the foundation. But today I want to touch on your role and your activism and the many things that you have done. Now, of course, you were an activist, you're a political member in Namibia. You have faced very many challenges. I think you're one of the pioneers in terms of pushing for a decolonial society. And much of that carries a very strong history. And part of that history involves also a lot of militarization. And the reason I'm asking that is because our society today is so violent that in every aspect, if you look at it, both symbolic and subjective violence, we are surrounded by violence. And as freedom fighters or terrorists, whichever camp you're in and whoever is labeling you, I'm sure you've also experienced a lot of violence. How did you project or feel this violence, and what do you see has happened in terms of the resistant movements post, independence, etc.?
It's a very interesting and important question, but let me tell you that I was always privileged. I have never been really exposed to the amount of violence that most of the colonized were, because even in resistance to apartheid, your pigmentation makes you privileged. So I can't really authentically relate to what violence means to you when you're exposed to it, because I was banned, I was exiled, but I continued to live a pretty convenient life. So my radical ideas never required
radical
to bear
implementation.
The brunt.
Yes.
But what I experienced is, of course, how the war affects its people. And that violence is not a good midwife for peaceful, non-oppressive minds. But that even if it's revolutionary counter-violence, which you justify as legitimate, has an impact on how you perceive and how you interact. So, and that is the tragedy, that in an armed struggle for some alternative future, the seed is planted of the old regime you are fighting against. Because if you want to win such a fight, you have to have forms of resistance that are able to beat the enemy. And you have to think in a we, they divide. The other is the enemy, and you need to be a better fighter to win. So if you want to overcome an apartheid regime that ruthlessly violates human rights, you can't maintain your innocence, because then you have lost the struggle before you started.
But while you're talking, I'm thinking about Nelson Maldonado Torres's theory, and he speaks about when you engage in this ontological suspension of the other, then ethics is suspended and then war becomes naturalized. Would you then say that in that case also for the resistance fighter, at that point when you're making a choice, their ethics also has to be suspended in order for them to continue the struggle to reach a particular goal?
That is part of the dilemma. And there's an Indian post-colonial philosopher, Ashish Nandi. He used the Indian case for a book, one of the pioneering books for post-colonial studies, which he calls the intimate enemy. And I think that's a very catchy and appropriate picture. And by the time we were successful in the struggle, we were not switching on the light, and now we were all Democrats, showing respect of otherness, give recognition to differing views. That's not how it works. We were deformed. We were suspicious. We maintained the practices, the survival skills of operating in secrecy. We never trusted anyone. That's not a good fundament. And we violated human rights in exile. Let's be quite honest. And sometimes, and I use it not for being cynical, but sometimes I'm tempted to say what protected Mandela was that he was locked away in Robben Island. He was never involved in internal power struggles of the movement. He was never exposed to become violent before violence makes him a victim. So he could afford, kind of, to be released and be so much more tolerant than most of the other comrades who survived in exile and returned. And let me use one of the most recent examples I find very striking. When the evening of Tuesday, the no confidence motion was dismissed,
Yes.
President Zuma's response was to stand and sing and dance. And he was singing struggle songs. 20 plus years into democracy. So his body language, the topics he personifies and embodies, is the continuation of a struggle in times where we should actually leave the struggle mentality behind. Continuing to think in these terms, in these dichotomies, is toxic. And I think that is one of the sad legacies of the legitimate anti-colonial struggle we were fighting, that while we thought it's a struggle for liberation, at the end we were at best partly liberated.
You raise very, very dynamic points, and I want to touch on two of them. The one is that basically what you're saying is that those who fought in this legitimate anti-colonial struggle become completely enveloped in a form of schizophrenia that never leaves them, and so that even into the new dispensation, you become the monster that you fought against and not realizing that you're perpetuating that same kind of violence, one. And secondly, in speaking about President Zuma and his struggle songs, at this moment which you say is 20 odd years into democracy, is it that many of these veterans or these fighters or these struggle heroes are stuck in the past and are not able to project forward?
Absolutely. And I think it's for the younger generations, the born frees, to transform really society. The way transformation is spoken about now by the older generation is reproducing an old system in new forms. What we need are the youngsters who were raised in a different, less toxic environment, who have other perspectives, who can kind of afford, because they are not penetrated by these dichotomies, to look for true alternatives to transform, to exchange, to interact, also with others who are not, because of their pigmentation, considered an enemy, with curiosity, with openness. And it relates also to religion or other forms of perceived otherness, because very often otherness is not so different.
We are more or less alike than we would like to believe, I suppose, or we are led to believe.
We should look beyond the surface and realize we are all humans.
But you put forward a very good proposition, and you're saying that the youngsters, the youth, must try and find this. And I too, I'm very optimistic about the potential of the youth, because if throughout history, if you look, it is the youth that brought change. But in the climate that we're in, well, the older individuals and those who have access to power are so reluctant to let go or to allow the entry of the young ones in. You know, how possible is that possibility?
Well, we had a lot of changes in history.
Yes, we did.
So, I'm not trying to evade the answer, but I'm looking for where's the positive?
Yes.
It needs time, it needs perseverance, and maybe it requires also the biological expiry date of the older generation. Let's put it quite crudely. The longer we wait, the better are the chances that a younger generation is moving in and taking over, and is less intoxicated by that history. So what I observe, however, is that it's very frustrating to be in the waiting. And many of the younger are not politically engaged because they say, why should we pick up a fight with the old men? And it's mainly still the male version, the old men. We are considered to be rude. It's against the culture. Now that already has a normative imposition.
Yes.
Who defines what the culture is? Well, it's not the younger generation. So many of them either become very cynical and say, okay, let's join the greedy ones and make money as much as possible, and I couldn't care less about anything else.
Or back away.
Or, like you now have the radicalization among parts of the students to say, what the F, it's all the same, let's take the stones and throw them. It's both is unfortunately not the best way to transform. And maybe I've become too old, but I would then say we have to be a little bit patient. You know, a water that breaks the stone needs very long.
Yeah.
But if you give water long enough time, the
It
drops dripping,
It will rub at it, yes.
it works.
Yes.
And I would like to see a younger generation with the perseverance, with a long-term project, with the visions, and say, even if we might have to take a detour, even if we once end in a one-way street and have to go back, we have that vision. Mm-hmm. We are not abandoning that, because it's not only for the benefit of our future, it's for the benefit of the future of our children and their children. And that would be my hope, I would say. And you find people who are like that.
And I think we just need to look for more of those people and reach out. But before we conclude this segment, I want to come to another part of that whole responsibility, and part of that responsibility is also accountability and shared responsibility. So it's not only of the citizens in the state, but the shared responsibility of those who have inflicted this trauma and schizophrenia on the populations here. And recently you made an interesting comment about the genocide in Namibia. Would you like to share your thoughts a little bit on that very quickly?
Well, the genocide that happened 110 years ago in Namibia, then German Southwest Africa, the colonial name of the German Empire, is a typical example that what William Faulkner once called, the past is not dead, it is not even past. It lives on in different ways. It lives on among the descendants of the victims in Namibia, who were not only victims, because they were in active resistance. So it's already a bit misleading to call them victims. But they were the victims of the genocide because of their resistance, because of being active in history. But that is presence. The youngest children in Namibia from the groups of the descendants, the Nama and the Ovaherero, they know very well what happened to their great-grandparents.
That's interesting. So they're aware of the history.
And if you go to Namibia, half of the commercial farmland is still in the possession of white German-speaking farmers. And they didn't buy that land. Now that's very obvious in an analogy to South Africa, I guess.
Yes, it is.
And you have your ancestors even buried on these farms, and because they are private property, you're not even allowed to visit the graves.
Yeah, I know.
So there is something that you need to correct. That is injustice, and it's engraved in today's society. And if you don't address it, then it's not only to the disadvantage of the descendants of the victim groups, but for the group I'm part of, the German-speaking whites in Namibia. Because we need to do our share in reconciliation. We need to contribute to address historical injustices and trying to put them right.
Okay, but I have to stop you there because we're going to a break. We'll conclude this in the next segment. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me today in the ITV networks with my very special guest and a dear colleague, Professor Henning Melber. And before we went on to the break, we were speaking about responsibility and accountability in the context of the violence and the violence in our societies. And Henning was explaining to us a little bit about the genocide in Namibia. So Henning, you're talking about this accountability, and you're saying that, you know, in terms of reconciliation and reaching a better society, you have to acknowledge your role, and all white German-speaking Namibians have to acknowledge their role and do something to make it a better place. How do you take that, understanding that framework, that context, and then bring it to South Africa, where you see an almost complacency amongst white South Africans, first to even acknowledge that they carry the burden, the white man's burden, that they carry this burden of apartheid, that they are still in a position of privilege, because there is almost a sense of denial amongst white South Africans.
Absolutely. And when I say we have to be accountable and act accordingly, I'm not saying or implying we should run around with a chip on our shoulders and say mea culpa and this guilt and how I can do it. No, that's not. But it's, so to say, the reminder that we have to do something. We have to address injustices, not only in the interest of those who were unjustly treated, but in the interest of the previous perpetrators. In my own interest of wanting to be a truly human being who applies dignity as a concept to each and every one in this world. It's not only me who is entitled to dignity. Everyone is entitled to dignity. And if I would dismiss that or act in a way where I deny dignity to others, I forfeit my own dignity. I'm not dignified any longer. So what I'm arguing is it's in my individual selfish interests to behave decently and make things work better. And I do that by trying to contribute to a society which is guided by respect for each other. And that would then bring a lot of security. Maybe I wouldn't drive a Porsche Mercedes, but even the smaller car would be pretty secure, but because no one would be interested in stealing it.
So the quality improves.
The quality of life. What is the quality of life? These material, greedy possessions, is that quality of life? I find these very impoverished people. And I know that this is a counter-narrative they wouldn't share. But then I would still argue and appeal to them to say, if you're interested in your own future, even out of this selfish interest, then properly behave and act accordingly and correct some of the things that were wrong in the past.
That's so true. And whilst you're speaking, I'm thinking about also how language frames the understandings that we have, the concepts, our perceptions, our definitions, and how something is defined, then of course automatically trains you to refer to that particular thing or to categorize that particular concept. So part of this structuring and framing and reconceptualizing occurs also in the term middle class. And you've recently edited and published a very interesting book on the African middle class. So tell us a little bit about this, because this is, Lorenzo from Gavin has been arguing that Africa is certainly not rising, and there are many things that need to be considered in terms of the extraction from Africa. And you have written this very, very controversial book also, I think, in terms of the understanding of what is a middle class. Is there such a concept as an African middle class? I'm asking you, is there such a thing as an African middle class?
Well, let me first tell you, you found a very clever way of switching from one subject to a completely different one.
Thank you.
To put it in a nutshell, the whole hype about African middle class on the rise is ideological humbug.
Okay, that's a very pleasant way of saying it.
And it was actually kind of invented by international economists who commented on tendencies elsewhere, mainly China with the trickle-down effects, where you had growing monetary income, growing amount of people who were elevated out of poverty, and for them qualified as middle class. The same to some extent in India. But then the African Development Bank jumped on the bandwagon. And how they defined middle class is mind-boggling, because they fiddle with figures. And as low as $2 a day income or expenditure qualifies you as middle class. Now, everyone who listens now would say, what if I go to Pick and Pay with $2 a day? I mean, I buy 2 liters of milk and then there's the money gone.
Yes.
And that makes me middle class? Others said, well, you need $5 or $10. But it doesn't say anything about savings. If your salary check stops the next day, then it's the end of middle class. So what kind of middle class are we talking about? And the other striking phenomenon is they use the term class, void of any concept of class, never mind class analysis. It's much more than just a monetary income. It's habitus, it's positioning. Then you have the notions of a class for itself and a class in itself. So are you aware that you are a middle class? What is your common awareness? And if you look at South African society, you might have 7, 8, 9, 10 different groups who, in terms of monetary income, might all qualify in a generous way as middle class, but they have very little in common. Especially in a society where race matters as much, if not more.
More, I would say, yes. But there is this dialogue in the South African circles that says that there is a growing middle class, black middle class in South Africa. From your research, would you concur?
Well, if you apply these monetary figures, then there was indeed a trickle-down effect for a growing black middle class after democracy was achieved, because they moved into administration, at least the middle-level management of companies who wanted to pretend they do affirmative action. They are in the political layers. So there was an increase in black middle class.
Right.
If we stick to that term. It's stagnating. And as we know, if we are in a state of recession, then that middle class is not growing.
And it simply dwindles very quickly.
It's actually shrinking. And that is a general trend in the whole of Africa. After the fat years are over with the terms of trade, the middle class in African societies is shrinking, actually. And an interesting indicator that speaks to that is that those international companies that are in the consumption sector, like food and cosmetics, they reduce their stuff and their investment because the purchasing power is reduced on the continent. They are not making more business, they make less business. So that shows this hype about the middle class is actually something I'm not someone who preaches conspiracy, but I can't help to think it comes very handy to those on the neoliberal track who say, well, you see, development works. Free market, and we have a growing middle class, and they are the torchbearers of democracy. And Actually, we have some of them who argue we should shift from a pro-poor policy to a pro-middle class policy.
Oh, wow.
Now, where on earth is middle class progressive? China was the most prominent example. They don't bite the hand they feed them. The Chinese middle class is a product of the Chinese state policy. They are not more democratic. The interesting thing in South Africa will be that we see already that a black middle class is starting to reposition itself. But again, in the plural, there is not one homogeneous group.
Of course.
But as we could see last year in the municipal elections, voters changed. ANC loses people we can assume are black middle class. It will be very interesting in the next elections how black voters of a kind of a middle class position themselves. If, of course, the DA continues to have people like Helen Zille, then she matches Zuma to an extent that it would be very difficult for a black middle class to switch from the ANC to the DA.
Yeah, so we're in very challenging times, but we're almost at the end. Perhaps, you know, from everything that you put together in the book, what was the strongest, most powerful point that stuck with you as a take-home message?
Don't fall for the hype, but don't abandon class analysis. Take the misleading middle class hype to re-enter proper class analysis. That would be a political consequence which would have a positive effect.
So you're basically asking those who do this kind of work to move away from lazy, you know, status quo kind of analysis, to just jump on the bandwagon. But that applies to almost everything in terms of academics today. The university that we're sitting in, and that's the decolonial cry, isn't it? To re-envision, to re-examine, but most importantly, to question what is being told to you or what you're being fed.
Absolutely. Remain suspicious when it comes to dominant discourses, but at the same time remain curious and undertake your own investigative efforts to explore what is in a discourse and what is not, and then try to fill the gaps.
And that's why I agree with you when you said that, you know, we should depend on the youth, because there's a tradition in Islam also. But the Prophet ﷺ said, take advice from the young people. So maybe we're at that point now where we have to look at them and see what it is that they are thinking and what it is that they are uncovering, because they will give us perhaps a new vision.
And despite me talking a lot, because that's what you expected, also stop and listen.
That's very important. But thank you very much for these wonderful words of wisdom, Henning, and for sharing your insights from the very different discussion that we started with towards a possible, I think, a very dynamic vision, and that is to listen and to give the youth a chance. So with that, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء.
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار